Edwards. I'm a co-chair of the American Society of International Law annual meeting and the deputy head of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights Tolerance and Non-Discrimination Department. So it's my pleasure to introduce the final session in the American Society of International Law's Global Engagement Series. But before we begin, I wanted to express my deepest sympathies for the families and loved ones of the members of the Asian American and Pacific Islander community that were murdered this week in the shooting in Georgia. I truly hope that the investigation into any possible bias motivations will be swift and effective and that justice will be served. So for today's event, as a brief recap, as part of its 2021 ASIL virtual meeting, the American Society of International Law invited our members and our colleagues in each region to participate in 2 weeks of special preview sessions on Reconceiving America's Global Role in the Biden Era, International Perspectives. Organized in collaboration with ASIL members and partners in each region, Africa, the Americas, Asia, and Oceania, and Europe, each regionally focused session was scheduled to enable participants from within the region to participate live. So we're grateful that our speakers are coming from all over the globe and all different time zones, and we hope that you will all very much enjoy today's discussion. And we also, of course, encourage everyone to join us at the ASIL annual meeting next week from March 24th to 26th, and you can still register at asil.org. Today's session is the final session of the Global Engagement Series. This evening's discussion will discuss critical areas of engagement between the US and Asia on their various interests and how the incoming Biden administration's policies and interpretations of international law will affect US relations with countries in Asia. Today's session is co-sponsored with our partner, the Asian Society of International Law, and you and our live audience can ask questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So it's my distinct honor to introduce the session's moderator, Dawn Yamane Hewitt, a partner in the Washington, D.C. and Tokyo offices of Quinn Emanuel Urquhart and Sullivan, where she focuses on international arbitration and government investigations. She was the former Deputy General Counsel of Strategic Initiatives at the U.S. Department of Commerce during the Obama administration, as well as the immediate past president of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of the Greater Washington, D.C. region. So Dawn, we're so grateful that you could join us today at a very early time in DC, and I'll turn things over to you to introduce the panel.
Thank you so much, Christy, and thank you to ASIL for hosting this panel, and thank you to my panelists and the attendees as well. We've got 4 different time zones actually across the panelists. I'm sure with the attendees, we might actually have the whole planet covered. So thank you for being up early or late or being with us from wherever you are, whenever you are. So here we are to discuss the Biden administration's policies towards Asia. President Biden has been in office for almost 2 months now, and he's pledged to embark on a radically different course in terms of Asia policy and foreign policy in general from the previous administration. He's pledging a strong focus on Asia. It's really a top foreign policy priority for the Biden administration. He staffed his team with experts from experts in the region, and he's going farther than President Obama's pivot to Asia. President Obama had his signature pivot to Asia, and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was a key component of that. But the Biden administration will likely go farther than that. We're seeing steps towards this already. The Trump administration, as everyone probably knows already, was really a retreat from global leadership. He had much more of a transactional and confrontational approach to allies in Asia and everywhere. He also employed hateful rhetoric towards China in particular. And this has fanned the flames of hate at home, as seen in a rise in hate incidents and hate crimes against Asian Americans in the United States, as we've seen and as Christy mentioned. But President Biden aims to reverse all this and reassert the U.S. as a leader in the world community. And we've seen a lot of this already, and our panelists will be talking about some of these new moves. So on his first day, for example, he signed a letter to re-enter the U.S. into the Paris Agreement, the Global Climate Pact. So the U.S. is now back in. He also joined on the first day the World Health Organization. So these are also big steps. He's also promised to rejoin the Iran nuclear arrangement agreement, and which is known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And our esteemed panelist, Pouria Askari, will speak about this. He's also lifted a hold on the naming of a new World Trade Organization Director General and freezing that organization. And he signaled interest in potentially trying to renegotiate the TPP to get back in. He's held a Quad summit, virtual summit of the Quad, Quad being an alliance of Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin are in the region now. And President Biden will be welcoming Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga as the first foreign leader to visit him in the White House next month. So a big part of the administration's visit to Asia and also Prime Minister Suga's visit to the United States will be assembling United Front on China. And we have esteemed panelists, Jiangyu Yang, to speak about that. But there are also many other issues on the global agenda for President Biden and his administration. There are global issues that require global cooperation, like the pandemic and climate change. And the Quad countries that I mentioned, they announced an effort to ship vaccines for the coronavirus to Southeast Asia. This is seen as potentially countering China's vaccine diplomacy efforts. But there are other issues with China as well, competition, cooperation, and possibly even confrontation. And Zhang Yu will be speaking about that. There's also other human rights issues in the region. Within China, there's the human rights abuses against the ethnic Uyghurs. But in Myanmar, there's also issues regarding the Rohingya population. And Yasmin Ullah is here with us, our esteemed panelists, to speak about that issue as well. Of course, there are other issues that we won't be able to cover. North Korea's continued threat to the region and advancement of and development of new weapons, Afghanistan policy, the cost of stationing troops in Japan. There's a lot more, of course, going on in the Asia region, but we want to do a deeper dive on these three issues in China, Myanmar, and Iran, because we could do a whole day on a summit just discussing all the different areas in Asia. But I think these three issues will be very interesting for us to discuss. We've got a fabulous gathering of intellectuals from the Asia region with backgrounds in foreign policy, economics, human rights, and international trade. And we will be able to hear from the three of them. So I'm going to introduce the three panelists, and what I've asked them to do is to give just a brief introduction of their area, and then we'll try to make this a little bit more interactive. I'll ask some questions, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. So let me introduce our three panelists. I'll start with Jiangyu Yang. He's a professor at City University of Hong Kong School of Law. He's based in Hong Kong, but he's a China expert. He's written a lot of books on the area. He's qualified to practice in both China and New York, and he's worked at the legal department of the Bank of China. And he's worked in law firms, Chinese and US law firms as well. He was also a tenured faculty at the National University of Singapore for more than a decade, where he served as the director of the Asia Law Institute, and he was the founding deputy director of the Center for Asian Legal Studies. He's also the editor-in-chief of the Chinese Journal of Comparative Law, and he was the joint editor-in-chief for the Asian Journal of Comparative Law. And Zhang Yu is going to talk about lessons from the US-China trade war during the Trump years, and looking forward to trade policy in China and US in the Biden area, and he'll have some thoughts for the future as well. Yasmin Ullah is a Rohingya social activist, social justice activist based out of Vancouver, Canada. She is the former president of the Rohingya Human Rights Network, which is a nonprofit group led by activists across Canada. And she was a research coordinator at Free Rohingya Coalition, a global network of Rohingya activists who share common concerns about Myanmar's genocide and the need for Rohingya survivors to play an active role in seeking a viable future for their community. She'll be talking about the human rights situation in Myanmar, U.S. foreign policy in dealing with that situation, and the approach to a democratic transition in Myanmar. And we'll also talk about the military and some of the economic aspects of that. Finally, we have Puriya Askari. He is an assistant professor of public international law at Alame Tabatabai University in Tehran. His research interests include investment arbitration, international humanitarian and human rights law, and public international law. He's an executive council member of the Asian Society of International Law, so welcome, and also a practicing attorney in the fields of investment and commercial arbitration, business contracts, and Iranian laws and regulation. And Puriya is going to discuss the background of the content of the Iran deal, the situation as of the US withdrawal date on May 8th, 2018, and the current controversy of the deal under President Biden. So with that, you can see we have some fabulous panelists today, and I would look forward to this discussion. I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to give us a sense of where we are now by laying the groundwork for how we got here with in terms of each person's area. And then I'll engage them in a conversation about each of their policy areas. And I'll, like I said, leave some time open at the end for questions. So with that, let me start with Jiang Yu. What can you tell us about China and the US and what we can, what we're seeing now in terms of the trade policy?
Thank you very much, Dawn, for the very kind introduction, and many thanks to the American Society of International Law for the invitation. So in my limited time, following Dawn's instruction, I will be very brief and briefly talking about the US-China trade relations. I will divide my introduction into three parts. In the first part, we will talk about what lessons can we learn from the trade war between China and the Trump administration, and the second, how trade policy has been practiced by China and the U.S. in the Biden era, and the third, I will make some future forward-looking observations. So first one is what lessons can we learn from the trade war between U.S. and China during the Biden era? During the Trump era, if we assume that the trade war has ended. Quite interestingly, so from an international law perspective, and very interesting lessons, how easy it can be for superpowers to violate international law in the form of a trade war. So if you look at both the Trump administration's punitive measures imposed on Chinese exports and also China's retaliatory measures, they both nakedly violated international law, especially WTO rules, the Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, as well as a few provisions, especially Article 23 of the DSU understanding. So it appears that both countries, the world's two largest economies, very much marginalized international law in general, and international and WTO law in particular. So that is one lesson. Probably from the perspective of international relations, it's easier to understand. So one theory of international relations taught us that maybe tit for tat is the best strategy if you are in the gaming process. That raises a very interesting question about how international relations, so how the teachings of international law and international relations diverge. So that's the very that is about the first point. The second point, so how trade policy has been practiced by the Biden administration and by China now. I think it's quite clear that the Trump administration left a very negative, generally negative impact on international law. It's so clear, it's so obvious, as Don mentioned, that the Biden administration is in the process of addressing those rather hostile trends toward the international law, such as the withdrawal of the opposition to the WTO Director General, and also return to the WHO, and it appears to be more positive toward the WTO reform. And but that said, if you ask the perceptions here, from the Chinese perspective and the perspective of several Asian countries, the trade war is still going on because the punitive measures and the American punitive measures and the Chinese retaliatory measures haven't been withdrawn. And in addition, the Biden administration has also imposed further sanctions against Chinese companies, of course, for various reasons. So from that point of view, the trade war is still going on. I mean, this is easy to. I think it's not so difficult to understand it from in the American context. Given the Democratic Party's own policy and ideological preference, as well as some structural constraints internal to the U.S. politics. So the Biden administration has to carry on with this. So on the Chinese side, there are two very interesting, seemingly contradictory developments. One is that externally, so China has been carrying on with its economic liberalization. For example, China has tremendously improved the legal environment for doing business. So its rank in the World Bank's doing business index was drastically moved up. And also the Chinese, so China has been opening wider its door for foreign investment, especially foreign financial institutions. Of course, one can argue that this is, very much because of the trade war, right? So instrumentally, the Trump administration pried open the China's economy through the trade war, and but it can also be argued that the external economic liberalization has been a consistent Chinese economic policy since Deng Xiaoping. But the other trend is we have also seen very, very obvious state involvement, intensified and strengthened state involvement in the economy. And the trade war actually left a very negative impact here because in the first stage of the trade war, so China. The trade war was very much caused by China's emphasis on Made in China 2025 and China's the subsidization of its state-owned enterprise. So in the first stage of probably in the first few months, the Chinese government seems to be ready to withdraw those rhetoric to lower down the tone of the rhetoric, and was about to do something to reduce state involvement. But in the second stage of the trade war, as nothing was changed, so China actually began to strengthen state involvement in the economy, and the Chinese government is proposed the idea of so-called dual circulation, which is a policy to stimulate domestic consumer demand and reduce reliance on foreign trade and investment, and to make China ready to be more self-reliant. So that's we have seen these two rather contradictory developments. And let me quickly make some the forward-looking observation. It depends on how the U.S. and China can work with each other. I see three scenarios. The first one is the confrontational scenario. So if the U.S. and China continue to, if they don't work with each other, and if they refuse to cooperate, then trade war in some form might be resumed. So nothing can be achieved, and so the whole world will suffer. The second scenario will be kind of a pragmatic approach. So the U.S. and China are although it's difficult for them to make some innovations in international economic policy, but they would at least stop being confrontational, and the WTO seems to be the common denominator, so they can resort to the existing rules and the traditional mechanisms of the WTO to resolve their dispute. The problem is that WTO has a limit because it doesn't address some of the new issues such as e-commerce, such as state-owned enterprise, and such as the so-called predatory trade practice, which the US is very much want to address. And the third scenario can be something called more idealistic. It requires the two countries to be both pragmatic and cooperative. So so US and China work together on those new issues I just mentioned. So they work together to be pragmatic enough. So US recognize Chinese concern on its state-led economy. It cannot just dismantle it overnight. And the China recognize American interest on fair competition. So they work together to establish rules for those new issues. That will be the most ideal situation I would love to see. Thank you very much. That's all for me now.
Thank you, Zhang Yu. Let's move to Yasmin, who's going to talk to us about human rights in Myanmar.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and thank you, the organizer, for your kind invitation to speak to the audience and to speak on this issue that is more pressing than ever. Currently, the military has staged the coup since February 1st of this year, and it has overthrown the elected officials, specifically the NLD leadership, and some of the NLD politicians have been incarcerated, and they're being charged with arbitrary arrests and charged with arbitrary criminal charges. It's quite worrisome, to say the least, that the democratic transition that we'd all hoped for sort of tumble down, and this is where we are at. Currently, there are probably more than 200 deaths that have been reported. More so in the ethnic and rural area of Myanmar because of the less access to those areas, as well as the tightening of the military's control. So the current issues of Myanmar revolve around one entity specifically, and probably you can already guess it. It's the military institution that has already been established and exploitative of the entire country for a very long time, for the past over 70 years, since the country had regained independence from the British colonialists. My apologies. So from that time onward, there was this transfer of power to the military institution. And since then, the military generals have staged the coup probably about 3 times. Since 1962, this is our 3rd time. And the destabilization of the economy, of the political landscape, and other aspects of life in Myanmar in general have happened. And we've never actually regained our strength to be able to sort of fight back against a system that weighs down upon us. And coupling with the neoliberal agenda, where globalization have been emphasized, and the idea of economic growth is extremely is viewed as natural and something that we all should pursue. The unrealistic expectation is that the only people who will benefit from it turn out to be the military in Myanmar, because they own the resources, and they have the arms to be able to enforce the growth or enforce the exploitation, extractions of resources and other methods in order to keep their economic interest to be at the advantage point regardless of who suffer in the country. So there's a couple of slides that I would like to share just to, help my explanation to kind of put things in the perspective for you. Let me just quickly share the screen. I hope you can see this. Can you see it?
Yes, I can.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so first, before we start, it would be important to actually discuss the structure of the hierarchy. So currently, the military actually own at least 134 private businesses through two enterprise, which is the Military Economic Holding Limited, as well as the Military Economic Corporations. And these are the two giant enterprise that have basically, done a lot of work around resource extraction, land leasing, and finance in the country. So the shares are paid to individuals and the military regiments who are notoriously involved in genocidal acts as well as war crimes and crimes against humanity. So as you can see, this is, the top of the list is General Min Aung Hlaing, who actually masterminded the Rohingya genocide in 2017. And he stands to benefit from every single thing that goes back into the military enterprise. And the reason why I brought this up is because when economic growth is the only viable and sustainable, or is the only thing that the military perceives as something acceptable, as something to aspire toward, it becomes, an enabling tool for the military to oppress people further and further. And that has been the ongoing trend for the past 70 years, not just with the Rohingya, but across Myanmar. The land rights issue have become a major theme of all of these violations of human rights. It always comes back to the land rights issues. It's always come back to the disenfranchisement of people in order to basically expel them from certain areas in order for those areas to then become mined or be developed into a special economic zone. And this is the information that I've gotten from the UN fact-finding mission that had done some investigations on the military businesses back in 2019, and they've released this report in basically in support of further international economic sanctions against the military enterprise. On top of that, it is really important to actually emphasize how much of the military's budget have been increased for the past, decade. But before we can even go there, we need to address some of the issues around the democratic transition. So since 2011, the Obama administration actually eased off the sanctions against Myanmar enterprise, against the military companies. At the news of releasing of the de facto leader, then de facto leader of the NLD, the perceived democratic leader of the country. She became the civilian leader of the NLD for a number of years, and won the election, the democratic election. And there was a lot of buzz around how this is, the new era of Myanmar, and things are going to get better after years of military regime. But the thing is, the issue that came out of the civilian leadership led by the NLD was that there had been a lot of human rights violations around the country that continue ongoing, but also the changes in the constitution that the military has made for itself in 2008 had ensured that the military will always have the seats in the parliament in order to veto any further progress that the civilian leadership will make. On top of that, we have the military enterprise that continues to benefit from the foreign investments after the Obama administration actually eased off the sanctions. The foreign investment poured in, and we have seen that apart from that, the compromise that the NLD had made with the military had basically ballooned the military's budget to further, 3 times more than in 2011. In comparison to education and health budgets that have decreased slowly over the years, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic management. So there are a lot of things to unpack there, but this is just one part of why the military's existence is not just a regime that tries to stage a coup and take the control over the country, but it deeply is entrenched within the neo-colonial agenda, where the military seeks to exert its control over the population through human rights abuses. But in order to actually benefit from those human rights violations and exploitations, not because they're doing it for the sake of abusing people. There are certain aspects of cruelty that comes very, very close to that assumption, but the idea is to actually benefit off of the backs of the hardworking Myanmar people, including the Rohingya. And so you can see in this little bit of the graph that since 2011, the attacks that are targeting civilians have rose to that 272%. And this was during the reign of the NLD leadership, during the democratic transition that unfortunately the US and many other democratic nation states have actually praised and have actually used as an excuse to actually not deal with the human rights abuses within Myanmar, because it comes very close to the criticism that will then be based on the issues around foreign investment and economic ties to the Myanmar military. And further, a few points that I would like to make also is that since the coup of this year, since the coup of February had started, we have basically understood a little bit better as a community, also Myanmar in general, because the hatred within various different ethnic communities and the Burma people, the Burman, have been deeply influenced by the military in order to basically use the tactic of divide and conquer and instilling fear and intimidation through sexual and gender-based violence, specifically using that in order to instill the fear so that people don't actually have any more connection to their own land, and further fragmentation of the community, as well as the sense of belonging within the country. So it's easier for them to be disenfranchised, just like how Rohingya have been disenfranchised since 1982. Citizenship law had made us, not part of Myanmar. It was easier then for the military to continue this propaganda and narrative that Rohingya actually don't belong to Myanmar, and easier for them in 2017 to actually push us all out, 740,000 of us, push us all out to Bangladesh by killings, tortures, and other heinous acts of human rights violation, in order to empty the land for very specific reason. And this one is an example. So this is a Chakpyu port, a part of a town, basically a town that's very, very close to the Indian Ocean, you can see. And it has a lot of establishment, and it has been branded as special economic zone by the Myanmar military. And there is a pipeline that is built from Chokpyu port, which is within Rakhine State, where Rohingya used to live, where majority of Rohingya used to live. Right now, there are about 600,000 people that are living in Rakhine State that are still remaining. On top of that, out of that 200,000 people are living in internment camps. So this part of the town, this part of Rakhine State, where genocidal acts have been perpetrated by the military, have become the special economic zones and directly linked to foreign investments that come from China. The pipelines run straight through from Rakhine State to Kunming, Yunnan State. And so I'm going to stop sharing the screen just now, and bear with me a moment, please. Okay, there you go. So all in all, this is to come back to the idea that the centrist approach, at best, by both the Republican government or the Democratic government, has basically helped enabled the situations or worsen the situation of human rights violation in Myanmar, and embolden the military to change the constitution to make things less democratic and make things more authoritarian in a way. There are a lot of fear of losing control, losing ground of Myanmar to China. But it's sort of unfounded in a way, because capitalism will sort of help in this manner, because I in my personal belief is that China will not want to continue its ties with the military as long as it's not benefiting from it. So in order to achieve that, the international community, including the US government and hopefully the Biden administration, will actually pursue harsher sanctions and complete withdrawal from the economic enterprise that is the MEC and the MEHL, the two enterprises that the military owns and currently benefit from. So, it's really, really nice and gracious of the U.S. The Biden government, the Biden administration, that it has placed harsher sanctions to individual generals, specifically General Min Aung Hlaing, who was the criminal mastermind of the genocidal acts that have been perpetrated to the Rohingya in 2017, and also this current coup. But it's not nearly enough to be able to actually rid them of the power and the economic influence that has been gripping the population and keeping them in fear. The reality is this: people are at a very, very disadvantaged position. And the neoliberalism necessitates that foreign investments, foreign interventions, and humanitarianism needs to happen, needs to take place for economic growth. And this is all extremely unsustainable for the people in Myanmar. And for, in fact, for economic growth, because currently the entire country shuts down, the garment industry shuts down, people are not being paid, people are not spending, people are not actually living their lives, and they're continuing to suffer. To be able to regain our footing in this, past post the coup, whether or not we actually win over the military, will take a long time. And genuinely, the people who will suffer the most is the Rohingya people, ethnic communities, and the Burmese people in general. And so in order to prevent further war crimes and crimes against humanity and possibly a genocide, the Biden administration will have to make a difficult decision to actually place sanctions on these two enterprises, because sanctioning personal, individual general and the family is great, but cutting their lifeline will actually result in a true democratic transition. There are enough young people on the streets today that are risking their lives in order to, push forward the idea that democracy and federalism is needed within the country for Myanmar to flourish. But they're not being supported, or not being supported nearly enough for them to be able to subdue the military script on the economy and the political landscape. So to turn the table, it would need a lot more support from the Biden administration. And that will, the support itself will have to be one that is sustainable, probably in the next two or three decades. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you very much. I want to give some time to Poria, of course, to talk about the Iran deal. What can you tell us about where we are now with that?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. And hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you in this panel and also with other distinguished panelists. And I also have to say thanks to the American Society of International Law and also the Asian Society of International Law, and especially Professor Shirley Scott and Professor Tony Angi, who are both present. And it is really a privilege to be with you today to talk a little bit about the Iran deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, and international law in President Biden's administration. Well, Don, if you let me, in this introduction part, I will start with a little bit of the background of the deal as a reminder. Because as you all know, that it was in 2002 that the controversy over the Iranian nuclear program started. And after some years, finally, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, referred this case to the Security Council of the United Nations. And the Security Council adopted from 2006 a number of resolutions about this program. So all this time, there were negotiations going on between Iran and some other countries, including for a long time the EU3, this means, Germany, UK, and France, to find a solution for this. And in the last round of negotiations, which was started in 2013, the United States was also present. They have discussed more or less for 2 years, and finally it was on July 14, 2015, that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was concluded between Iran, United States, EU, China, Russia, UK, France, and Germany. And a couple of days later, the JCPOA was endorsed by the United Nations Security Council in the famous resolution 2231. And after that, it was on 18 October 2015, the adoption day in accordance with the JCPOA, that finally the deal came into force. There is also another important date in accordance with the deal, which is the termination day. And that is 10 years after the adoption day, that the Security Council will conclude its considerations of the Iranian nuclear deal. So what is the deal about? Of course, it is an extremely complex document, 159 pages, consisting the JCPOA itself and 5 very complicated annexes. And of course, there is no time to talk about all of this. But in short, I can say the whole deal was about Iran agreeing to limit its civilian nuclear program and to enhance the inspections regime by the IAEA. And in return, the P5+1 agreed to a coordinated lifting of the economic and financial sanctions related to the Iran's nuclear program. And here we mean both the Security Council sanctions and also the unilateral sanctions that were imposed by the United States and also by the European Union. So the deal was more or less working for 3 years, and we reached to the President Trump's presidency, who was all the time calling the deal a terrible one. And finally, it was on 8 May 2018 that if you remember, President Trump tweeted that famous poster on Twitter saying that sanctions are coming, and withdrew from the deal. And from that time, this famous maximum pressure campaign against Iran began and continued even in the time of pandemic. So we are talking here about hundreds of sanctions with lots of negative impact on Iran and the Iranian people. So that was what happened in 8 May 2018, which actually had a huge reaction from the international community. I can say, generally speaking, the international community never accepted the US justifications. I remember once President Trump himself participated in the meeting of the United Nations Security Council, and he tried to convince the US allies, but he was not successful. I mean, everyone was saying that, well, that was not correct, that you decided to cease the participation of the United States from the JCPOA. Many states and also UN officials opposed the sanctions, especially during the pandemic, but the reaction was more pressure and more sanctions. From the Iranian side, well, for the first year, Iran said, okay, we go for a strategic patience, we follow diplomacy to see if we can find a solution. And at the same time, Iran decided to bring the case on the basis of the 1955 Treaty of Amity between Iran and the United States to the International Court of Justice. And then after this first year, in accordance with paragraph 37 of the JCPOA, Iran decided to go for some steps and ceased performing of some of its commitments under the JCPOA. And all the time, Iran was saying that, well, these are reversible. And of course, I mean, whenever you go for your commitments, we will implement the JCPOA in full. So that was the situation that we had before President Biden. And President Trump really, till the last day, put more sanctions and more pressure on Iran. President Biden came to the office and he announced that the America is back. So many commentators, politicians, and those who were familiar with the deal and with the situation, and I would say many of the allies of the United States, they were expecting that, okay, something big is going to happen and the US will come back to the deal and will continue the participation. But actually, to be honest, no major changes happened. Okay, the President Biden's administration withdrew a letter that they sent to the United Nations Security Council to trigger the sanctions of the Security Council, which was actually never worked. But apart from that, nothing else is happening on the ground, as we can see here in Iran. The sanctions are still there and the suffering is still continuing. So I would say, in my view, from 8 May 2018, the United States is really violating its international obligations in accordance with various norms and treaties that I hope in the second round I will have time to elaborate more on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And today's panel is a short panel. It's only 60 minutes, so we have very little time, but I wanted to throw back at least just one question to each of the panelists. So to Jiang Yu, I'm curious to know, how the Biden administration is using foreign policy to advance, using trade policy to advance foreign policy in Asia, and how this is perceived and received in Asia, and particularly in China, by the domestic population.
Thank you very much, Dang, for the interesting question. When before the Biden administration, before President Biden was elected, there was a hope in Asia or even in China that President Biden would return to free trade and multilateralism. So U.S.-China trade relations can come back to normal like the Obama days and even the Clinton days. We have to give some benefit of doubt because President Biden has been in office just in about 3 months, and they are still probably watching, observing, analyzing, and thinking about what to do. But what has been perceived here is not much has changed. So the Biden administration continues with the tariffs, those protectionism policies, trade policies, and that is further strengthened by some domestic movement. For example, the Buy American Act, and also the effort to build infrastructure in the U.S., but relying mainly on American goods, American content. All those things I fully understand. They are very good domestic political reasons, but they don't generate a very positive perception here. So and also. We haven't seen the Biden administration come to pursue value-based trade policy. So value-based means, like I mentioned, the Obama days, the Clinton days. So the pursuance of trade policy itself as a value, rather than using trade policy to divide and conquer. So, but we have to. But it's still too early to make any judgment at this stage. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And Yasmin, you talked a lot about Biden's policies, what was missing, and how the military has continued its rule in Myanmar. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit and very briefly, because we have only 5 minutes left in the panel. I want to make sure we get to Puriya as well. But you could address the issue of corporate responsibility and what role that might have to play in Myanmar.
So there are a lot of businesses that are still continuing to deal with the military. Currently, the military enterprise is actually connected to at least 50 global banks. There are obviously a need to actually not just step back and look at everything in a grand scheme of things and how it has affected or enabled the military to this day, but reinvestigating what goes where and how things are influencing and helping the military to further violate the rights of the people on the ground would be one of the most important steps that the not just the Biden administration, but the international government bodies in general can do, and it will need to happen on both the international fora in terms of the UN mechanism, as well as the international government governing bodies, as well as the private sectors. It has to actually emerge and intersect in that manner in order for this to actually be a successful, supportive movement from the outside for the people who are fighting on the streets, on the ground, for their voices to be heard.
Thank you. And Puriya, could you talk a little bit more about the, when you talk about the U.S. still violating its obligations under international law, and if you have a little time, then what's the future of the deal from a legal perspective?
Well, I mean, talking about obligations, let me just refer to them, and then I move to the future of the deal, which is actually a very political issue. But I just want to refer actually to 3 things. I mean, the first is the deal is endorsed by the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231. And this means that there is an obligation for the United States in accordance with Article 25 of the Charter to follow what the paragraph 2 of the resolution is saying, which is to refrain from actions that undermine implementation of commitments under the JCPOA. This is first. And the second is, as I have said, Iran brought the case to the International Court of Justice, and in October 2018, the court issued an interim order or provisional measures. Based on that, the court asked the United States to remove most of its sanctions and also to ensure that licenses and necessary authorizations are granted for payment and transfer of funds. And beside all of this, if we just do not talk about the JCPOA or the United Nations Security Council resolution, we are talking about a huge number of sanctions with lots of sufferings for the Iranian people. I mean, if we just have a look to the numerous resolutions adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, the reports by the Special Rapporteur, the statements by different United Nations officials, we can see that everyone is saying that these kind of sanctions, which are really negatively impacting the human rights of the people, are not legal. So based on these three things, I think really, I mean, there is an obligation. And so if President Biden really wants to bring the America back, and if the President Biden really wants to follow the international laws and regulations, we have to say the deal is still alive and the obligations are clear. What I can say is, in accordance with Article 36 of the JCPOA, or paragraph 36 of the JCPOA, what the US is doing amounts to significant non-performance of the deal. And from the other side, as I have mentioned, Iran is using its right, I mean, talking about international law in the form of countermeasure, and in the context of the JCPOA, what Iran is doing is in accordance with paragraph 37. So, I mean, now the whole controversy about the future is who should move first. So if we believe that, okay, there is a state which is responsible for all the violations, I think it makes sense if, legally speaking, we say that that state should first halt the violations. And of course, Iran said immediately after that, we are ready to implement the deal in full.
Thank you very much. Well, I wish we had more time, but we are ending right on time at the 1 hour mark. Thank you so much to the panelists for sharing your thoughts today. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much to ASIL for hosting this panel, and thank you to our attendees. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again at the annual meeting, the ASIL annual meeting.
Thank you very much, Don.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
I would like to say Happy Nowruz to all the Iranians.